Hey there, Seb for the Realtor here. Are you a homeowner in the Bay Area and you're selling your home and the buyer is now asking you for an extension on the closing date? If you are a seller facing a buyer needing to extend the closing date, then you definitely want to watch this video. Hey, you know what? It's a fact of life. Closings do not always happen on time. It's actually probably more common than not that the closing does not happen on the actual scheduled date. Sometimes it can close early, but quite often it can close late, and it does not mean that it is the end of the world. Now, typically, on the way to the closing table, there are several milestones along the way where the buyer will need to do some specific actions, such as putting in their earnest money deposit and specifically releasing contingencies like the inspection contingency and the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency. If there is a delay in any of these checkpoints, like if the buyer is late on putting their earnest money deposit into escrow, or if they are late on releasing their inspection contingency, and especially if there is any delay with the appraisal or loan contingency release, that is a red flag to you, the seller, because if they are late with that, it is very common that they will also then be late with closing. So you want to make sure that your real estate agent is always in really good communication with the buyer's agent to make sure that they are always going to be meeting all of those deadlines on time. And if they are not going to be meeting those deadlines on time, you want to know the reason why. And sometimes there are good reasons why that are really no fault of the buyer because, hey, things happen. But if there is good communication between the parties, then it really shouldn't come as any surprise. You just want to see as a seller that the buyer is in fact working in good faith to make sure that they are doing everything that they can to meet all of the various deadlines along the way to the closing table. And if they are not meeting those deadlines, if they are not working in good faith, then that is certainly a huge red flag, and it tells you early on that you may not be closing escrow on time, or if even at all. Now, if the buyer does need to extend one of those deadlines in the contract, they will send you a simple extension of time addendum. It's a one-page form, and it will say what they need an extension on and until when. So it may say they need an extension on the earnest money deposit, or an inspection contingency, or a loan contingency, an appraisal contingency. Very simple. When you get that form, you can decide to sign it or not. Typically, you will sign that form if you want your deal to close. If you don't want your deal to close, if you feel the buyer lacks capacity to close or close in a time that works for you, you can simply not sign that extension of time addendum and instead send the buyer a notice to perform, which tells the buyer, hey, you need to release that contingency now, and if you don't, I, the seller, may unilaterally cancel the contract. But now let's assume, though, that the buyer has in fact released all those contingencies. Maybe there was a delay along the way, but the contract is still moving forward, and you are getting close to the time when you are going to be closing escrow. At least that's what it says per contract. But then you find out that the buyer is going to need an extension of time to close escrow. Well, in that case, the buyer would also then send in an extension of time addendum to you, the seller, and then you have the choice to sign it or not. I recommend that you don't just sign that extension of time addendum. First of all, you can just simply not sign the addendum. You don't have to agree to give them an extension. And then the power sort of lies in you as to the next step. You could then wait and sign it later, or you could then sign a demand to close escrow form. The demand to close escrow form is kind of like that notice to buyer to perform, only it is specifically for closing escrow. And the demand to close escrow gives the buyer 3 days from receipt of that form to close escrow, or you, the seller, will then have the ability to cancel the contract. It does not mean that you are canceling the contract. It simply means that you, the seller, have the unilateral ability to cancel the contract, and that is the only way at that point that you can cancel the contract. You must first send the buyer that demand to close escrow before you move to cancel the contract after the buyer's contingencies have all been released. But when a buyer makes a request to extend the closing date, I like to try to do some renegotiation with the buyer at that point. Because the fact of the matter is that the California Residential Purchase Agreement, our standard purchase contract, does not have any penalty to the buyer for extending the closing date. while in fact there may be significant costs to the seller to extend the closing date. For example, while you're owning this property, many times which you don't want to own the property anymore, oftentimes it is vacant, you are paying home insurance, you are paying property tax, you are paying maintenance, and you are paying utilities oftentimes. And actually, quite often, you'll also be paying a mortgage. So it may be costing you, the seller, hundreds of dollars a day every day that you are owning this house, which the buyer has agreed to already close by a certain date. So why not ask the buyer to pay you for the extension request? Again, there is no language built into the standard purchase agreement around any kind of remuneration to the seller for that extension request. One thing that I like to do is I like to say, hey buyer, if you are so certain that you are going to be closing escrow, but you need just a few extra days, why don't you go ahead and release the earnest money deposit to me? Now that is actually a really great thing to do because it will show you right then and there just how confident the buyer is in their ability to close the escrow at this point. Because if they are sure they can close the escrow, then why wouldn't they release the earnest money deposit to you? Or you could just say, you know what, why don't you release half of the earnest money deposit to you? If you find that the buyer is balking at releasing that earnest money deposit, but at the same time they're saying they're sure they're going to close, that is a little bit of an inconsistency. That is incongruent, and it certainly is a red flag to you. There are some other options, like you could charge the buyer a simple per diem fee. You could say, okay, buyer, well, listen, for every day that you want an extension, I'm going to charge you an extra $500. This does not get added on to the purchase price. It is just a credit from the buyer to the seller. Now there is a bit of a problem with that because if the buyer is getting a mortgage loan, that will increase the buyer's closing costs, which will need to be disclosed to the buyer on the closing disclosure document, which is a standard mortgage document. And when there is a change to that closing disclosure document, the buyer is given 3 more days by law before they can then sign loan documents. So if you are actually close to closing and you do want to do this per diem fee, then that is going to actually delay closing even further. So really that per diem fee is really only applicable when it is a cash buyer or when it is a buyer who is asking for a longer delay in closing, perhaps at least a week or 2 weeks. Now there are some other things that you could do to extract some concessions from the buyer. You could raise the purchase price. You could also ask for a free rent back, or you could also ask the buyer to just accept the property with whatever junk that you want to leave behind, because that might cost you thousands of dollars to move out. Why don't you just put that cost on the buyer? You could say, buyer, I'm not going to pay for your home warranty anymore. There are all kinds of things that you could possibly renegotiate in the contract right then and there, because when there is a change in one term of the contract, that really enables you to change any of the terms on the contract. Listen, if the buyer is asking for an extension to close escrow, it does not mean that your deal is not going to close. Don't freak out. Almost every time that you get to this point and the buyer is asking for an extension, you will probably still close. There may be a delay, but just don't worry about it. So long as the buyer and the seller still both want to get the deal done, so long as they both have the same objective in mind, almost always the deal will in fact close. But do not feel bad about asking for an early release of that earnest money deposit or some other concession from the buyer if you, the seller, are giving that concession of extra time to the buyer. All right, well, that is all I have for this video. I hope you have enjoyed watching it. And if you have enjoyed watching it by any chance, I'm guessing, totally a guess, that you might also enjoy some of these videos over here. These are some of the most popular videos here on my YouTube channel, so please do take a look. All right, that's all I have for this video. Thank you so very much for watching, and please stay tuned.